We are excited tonight that we have a very unique speaker with us, and her name is Dr. Nadya Williams. Dr. Williams earned a PhD in classics from Princeton University, where she completed her dissertation on Greek and Roman military history. Dr. Williams taught history for many years at the undergraduate and graduate level at the University of West Georgia and Florida Gulf Coast University. And in 2008-2009, she was a visiting lecturer of classics at the University of Texas at Austin. Alongside a long list of academic publications, including a plethora of articles, books, chapters, encyclopedia entries, you name it, she's the author of 3 books, Cultural Christians in the Early Church, which she'll be discussing tonight. She has a forthcoming book coming out just next month. I've already pre-ordered my copy. Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, which is published by IVP Academic. And then in 2025, she's got a book coming out by Zondervan Academic called Christians Reading Pagans. After 15 years as a professor of classics and history, Dr. Williams left the academy to be a homeschooling mother because she's like, hey, I'm putting in all this time and working with other people's kids. I want to invest in my children in this unique way. She's also, alongside of that work, which is a full-time job in and of itself, she is the managing editor for the magazine Current, where she also edits the Arena blog. She writes regularly for outlets you may be familiar with, like Christianity Today, Plow, Front Porch Republic, Providence Magazine, Fair Disputations, Church Life Journal, and more. So would you please put your hands together and welcome to the stage Dr. Nadya Williams.
Well, thank you. I don't get out much, so thank you. It's been a lot of fun to be around very grown kids today. So thank you for being here tonight on this lovely September evening. It is a time when the school year feels like it's kind of settled in, the routine, whatever it might be, depending on, your age and stage in education. And this means that perhaps by now you realize that there are not quite enough hours in the day to do everything that you want to do, all the wonderful things you could be doing. And as a result, I particularly appreciate that you chose to spend the next hour or so here listening to some stories that I want to tell you. And historians are, first and foremost, storytellers. And so what I would like to do tonight is tell you a bedtime story, or rather, several connected stories that I think are important. These are all true stories. They connect in intricate ways to tell a larger true story. It is a story about people, but it is, more important, a story about God who loves people. This story also involves alligators and crocodiles, some literal, others metaphorical. Let's begin with them. Early in my academic career, I taught for a year at a university in Florida. As is common for much of southern Florida, alligators dotted the landscape. Signs next to every body of water, however minuscule, dutifully warned you that alligators may be present. On my campus, it turned out that the warnings were not mere hypotheticals. The story that entered campus lore goes as follows. One perfectly ordinary morning, students and faculty arriving at the business school building, located next to a scenic canal, found a highly confused alligator stuck in the automated sliding doors of the building. The neighborly friendly guy had apparently climbed out of his watery habitat. He decided to stroll in for a class or a snack. But he got stuck, and there he stayed for a few hours, unable to move either forwards or backwards, until animal rescue came to his aid. Classes started a few hours late that day. I want you to hold on to this bizarre and unexpected mental image now. That poor, confused alligator, stuck in the doors of the business school. Because we will come back to him, I promise, in a more metaphorical way. But now, we can jump back a little over 2,000 years, because historians can totally do that in the blink of an eye. Let's talk crocodiles for a minute first. What is the difference between alligators and crocodiles? One will see you later, and the other after a while. But that is more of a scientific distinction, and I'm not that kind of doctor. So, on to historically significant crocodiles we go. One of our best sources for everything to do with ancient Egypt, including stories that pertain to the early church, involves crocodiles. Crocodiles sacred to the Egyptian god Sobek, himself a crocodile-headed god, lived the good life of all the snacks all the time. After death, perhaps an early one from all the good snacks they got in life, they got mummified. And those mummies were made of discarded papyri. Think bureaucracy of the sort familiar to us. All the paperwork that it took to run a massive province. All the tax records, buying and selling contracts, rental agreements, last wills and testaments, marriage and divorce decrees, and various village police documents anytime anyone had a cow stolen from their backyard. Everything in life requires paperwork to be filled out. Sure, the Byzantine Empire gets a bad rep on this, but the Roman Empire was much worse, or better, depending on your perspective. For historians, the more paperwork, the better, as long as it survives. As it happens, most such documents in other places in the Roman Empire did not survive, but in Egypt, of course, they did. And this is how we get certificates of pagan worship during the first empire-wide persecution of Christians in AD 251, during the rule of the Emperor Decius. The way that persecution worked was as follows. Everyone in the empire had to report to a district official by a designated date and perform a pagan worship rite, such as burning incense for the emperor. Then a certificate would be issued to the individual to certify that they were in good standing. In addition, though, some signed confessions survive in papyri from people who had good reason to be anxious about these procedures. One woman wrote and signed a confession both on her own behalf and that of her adult daughter. Not only did we perform the required sacrifices, she helpfully tells us, but she adds, we have been sacrificing to the pagan gods all along. Some of those who wrote such confessions were Christians. They were eager to survive the persecution, so they did what they had to do faced with a difficult choice. Their desire to return to the church after the persecution would also prove to be a topic of contentious debates for decades later. Should the church accept them back? Or should there not be second chances for traitors like these? I find documents like these a fascinating glimpse of culture shaping Christians. If the culture pressures you in such an extreme way to conform, what would you do? It is hard enough to be a Christian when there's no death threat hanging over us. All we have to worry about, much of the time, is the comfortable expectations of the modern world. So what was it like for people for whom it cost something, perhaps even everything, potentially their lives? And so we have in these documents, such as certificates of sacrifice, stories of real people wrestling with real dilemmas. And in the process, they look surprisingly normal, unglamorous, ordinary. We read about them and they seem too much like us in their lack of heroic behavior. Is this really what the early church was like? Did the early Christians behave more like me than, say, Augustine? That's just a little bit scary, strange, and probably not what you ever heard in Sunday school. There is indeed a tendency among Christians today to over-idealize the early church. It is tempting to think that these believers were so much more faithful than we are. But primary sources about regular believers from the New Testament on reveal a much more complex picture. They show that the early Christians were, rather, much more like us, likely to give up or give in if the going got too difficult. But the reason for our mistaken assumption and our over-idealistic view of the early church is also important to consider. After all, we're not entirely wrong when we think about early Christians as saints. We remember the most famous stories, the ones with the big names attached: Paul, Tertullian, Cyprian, Jerome, Ambrose, Melania the elder and the younger, Augustine. I could keep going, but you get the idea. There's a reason why some of these figures, we speak of them as the church fathers or the desert fathers and desert mothers. These famous saints and bishops and martyrs dominate our attention, and for good reason. Their stories are larger than life, but here's the problem. They're the exception rather than the rule. And they distract us from the real people, the really boring ones, who filled churches all over the ancient Mediterranean most Sundays and acted more like the Corinthian saints than St. Paul. Years ago, I read a fascinating book, The Bad Citizen in Classical Athens, by Matthew Christ. His argument was, we tend to over-idealize the Athenian democracy as the world's first democracy. We think of people like Plato, Socrates. Weren't they so wise? We think of the voting assemblies of citizens. We think of these wonderfully organized law courts on which our own legal system is now in part based. And in this age of fracturing in American politics, we think of this state where very different citizens manage somehow to coexist, keeping going on together through many challenges, internal and external. But Christ's argument is that if we listen to our primary sources more closely, we find that there were plenty of bad citizens, people who shirked military duty, deserted from the battlefield, tried to get out of jury duty with all kinds of dirty tricks, loved free entertainment that the state provided, but complained about such duties as voting or showing up for assemblies. Essentially, they complained about being citizens of the democracy. The classical Athenian democracy, in a nutshell, was filled with these bad citizens. We don't know the names of most of them. We know just isolated incidents and anecdotes about them. But we know enough to see a pattern of deep selfishness. Why? Because human nature, or we could say sin. But here's the striking thing. As a historian, before reading Christ's book, I had a very idealized picture of classical Athens, because the most famous Athenian citizens were these writers and leaders whose works and achievements I admire. There is a valuable analogy for us here for how we view any historical period or topic that we love deeply. We tend to view it with rose-colored glasses. And that is true for how we think about the early church as this time of heroic martyrs and dedicated believers, the few whose names and achievements we just know so well. Like Augustine. You have to love Augustine. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want him to be my pastor. Too angsty and intense, for sure. But he was absolutely unqualifiably brilliant and loved the Lord with exemplary passion. So there's no surprise that people like him just kind of suck all the oxygen out of the air, out of the room, when we think about the early church. But what are we missing in the process? We are missing everyone else. We don't know the names of the multitudes, the thousands of ordinary early converts who went to church most of the time and did whatever they felt like doing a lot of the rest of the time. But we can glimpse their stories, the good along with the bad and the ugly, from such primary source documents as these unglamorous confessions and certificates of sacrifice that I mentioned a few minutes ago. But every document has a lifetime. I'm not judging you if you, like my husband, keep printouts of tax records and doctor's receipts and Thanksgiving menus and shopping lists going back decades. But hear me out. You can probably let some of them go. And the same thing happened in antiquity. Once various documents had outlived their usefulness, in Egypt at least, they were recycled, reused as those mummy wrappings, mummy cartonnage. Strips after strips glued onto each other, creating these mummy casings. Great for mummifying sacred crocodiles, even better for historians. An ancient Egyptian's trash, it turns out, is a modern historian's treasure, especially with the help of modern digital technologies that allow us to reconstruct these, unroll them digitally. And what specifically these documents show us is culture. They answer the question that just a list of emperors or famous events from the ancient world could never answer. And that question is, what were real people like in the Roman Empire, including in the early church? And so, in these documents, we find particular cultural habits, which curiously enough were present among all people, Christians or not. The culture all around Roman Egypt, just as for us today, had easy built-in defaults for every aspect of daily life. How people thought about finances, food, marriage and sexuality, relationships and friendships, child rearing, patriotism, self-care, and the place of religion in everyday life. Culture, to quote historian Christopher Shannon, is secondhand smoke. You don't even smell it, but it clings to you. It becomes a part of you by proximity. And so when I speak about cultural Christianity, I am speaking of this secondhand smoke. And we need to distinguish it from another aroma, the aroma of Christ, the aroma of sanctity that the earliest believers wanted so desperately to emanate from everything they did and were in a world that was very different, a world whose culture was so hard to separate from the calling of Christ, just like it is for us today. And this is where alligators and crocodiles have an important message for us. You see, when it comes to culture, there's always danger, but we may not see it readily. Puddles and ponds don't look that big on surface. So why would we worry that something that might eat us could be lurking in one? It's the 21st century anyway, so the idea of getting eaten by an alligator just seems like a not very 21st century way to go, you know? But my point is, alligators may very well be present, but we may not see them until they are stuck in the very doors through which we were trying to go ourselves, metaphorically speaking. Here's the challenge, though. Talking about people being seduced by the culture around them involves talking about something very uncomfortable: sin. And so in early 2021, I began writing a book about just how many sinners there were in the early churches. I know, like, we all had something that we did during the pandemic. You may have made sourdough bread. I started thinking about sin. Okay, so, I don't know what it says about me as like a mother. Anyway, so, sorry, here I am processing this. Okay. Initially, I was thinking that this would be this riveting tale of sinners and the leaders who loved them and led them well, called them repeatedly out of sin into repentance, back into like church and a loving relationship with Christ. And I was thinking it could make for either an overly salacious book or a really depressing book to focus on rehashing sins and tales of sinners. But also I was thinking, you know, it's kind of outrageously entertaining, but okay, then there's this big important question: why do it? Why talk about sin in the history of the early church? And I really wanted this to be an encouraging book, which seems counterintuitive with this topic. But yeah, because you think like, well, books about sin and the people of God, like that's not super encouraging, right? But a few months into the writing process, finally the realization kind of hit me. I realized that the common thread connecting the lengthy catalog that I had accumulated of stories of sins and sinners in churches from really the New Testament era to the early 5th century, all of that, the common thread holding it all together was culture. And so that's kind of my argument. It's simple, but I hope ultimately encouraging, that churches from their earliest days to the present have always been filled with cultural Christians. And the way I define cultural Christians is believers who emphatically claim Christ and faithfully attend church, at least most of the time. But if we look at their lives, meaning externally visible fruit, and their way of thinking, to the extent that we can tell a way of thinking for anybody, we see behaviors and patterns of decision-making that reflect more the culture around them than the teachings of Jesus. Such culturally belief and culturally inspired behaviors can be readily seen, therefore, in all areas of life. So, views on money and property, sexuality and marriage and family, to politics and government, education, nationalism and patriotism, and more. So, culture, I just noted a couple of minutes ago, is like this secondhand smoke. It soaks into our pores to the point that we cannot even tell that we reek of it. But we act in accordance with it, for if we just passively go on with our lives, we can do no other. As the cliche goes, we are what we eat. But in a spiritual sense, this applies to what we consume in our everyday lives. Things we read, things that we watch on TV, social media, subjects of songs we hear, things we observe among other people all around. In a nutshell, all of the many, many things that form culture. You can't block off culture. You can't live in a vacuum. And this creates this dilemma that we cannot easily escape. Christians are meant to be in the world, but not of it. Unfortunately, that not of it part is awfully hard. The in the world part, we've got that one down pat, thanks. But this was just as true of the churches to whom Paul wrote in the 1st century AD. It was just as true of the churches that such famous leaders as Ambrose and Augustine rebuked in the 4th century. And it is just as true of the churches we attend today and churches in every period in between. Cultural Christianity is simply the default rather than the exception. It's not just that thing that happens organically in places and time periods where Christianity is the dominant faith in world history. Rather, because we're all formed by the culture in which we dwell, this secondhand smoke that we cannot help but breathe day in, day out, in ways that we sometimes cannot even fully identify and recognize. We are prone to distort the gospel in ways that make the most sense to us. We are, to quote a thought repeated throughout the Bible, wise in our own eyes. You're likely thinking at this point, okay, what? How could a book on all of this be encouraging? That's a good question. It is a story I explore. This story does offer at least some heroes, a few heroes. Leaders, in particular, who called out sin and called cultural Christians to repent and challenge the culture around. But more than anything, it is a story that shows that we are wrong to look for heroes in any period of Christianity. Ordinary people like us have always filled churches, and they have always been ordinary in their sins, as well as in their love for Christ. But this should redirect us to think of ourselves less and to think of ourselves as less amazing, even while this is a call to see our entire lives as a journey of sanctification, because that is what a Christian life is. And this idea that we need improvement, a new heart that only God can give us, that we need sanctification, this is all very, very countercultural, both for the default mentality of the 21st century and for the default mentality of the ancient world. A few years ago, I asked students in a freshman seminar, do you think you are a good person? Every hand in the room went up. Perhaps the Corinthians in the church to which Paul wrote 1 Corinthians would have raised their hands too. But Jesus reminds us, God alone is truly good. It is easier to identify cultural sins in hindsight, as we can do when we read Paul's first letter to this Corinthian church, written sometime in the early 50s AD. Here we meet people who are so cosmopolitan, Greek, Roman, in their behaviors about money, food, and sexuality. It is easy for us to shake our heads at them and be shocked that they saw nothing wrong with the flagrant sin in which they were living. But that's part of the point for us reading this today. Reading how easy it was for people in early churches to fall into cultural sin is a good practical exercise for us today as believers. In what ways do we take something around us for granted and justify it as something that surely fits in with the gospel, only to realize with a start, if we look more closely, that this was a false belief stemming from our own culture? In what ways are we deeply blinded simply by living in our place and time? What sins in our own lives are respectable sins? It is easy for us to be outraged at the respectable sins in the Corinthians' lives, such as frequenting prostitutes, so commonplace and not scandalous in the Roman Empire. But we are scandalized only because this is not a respectable sin in our society. But we have our own blind spots too, don't you worry. Or rather, please do worry. And so overall, the story of cultural Christians in the early church is both good news and bad news. The good news is, modern Christians like us, we are more like the earliest Christians than we had realized. The bad news is also that we are more like the earliest Christians than we had realized. At the end, what really matters is that we have the good news of the gospel, and that makes all the difference. But what does this look like in practice? Here's one story. A guy walks into a church one Sunday. As is usually the case, everyone is wondering, will he be back next week? He comes back the next week, and the one after. After a while, he is baptized and formally welcomed into the body. But as the rest of the congregation gets to know him, some red flags emerge. The situation becomes a massive headache for the pastor, and it really bothers many members of the congregation. People's lives can be so messy and unpredictable. The pastor of the church my family and I attended for 7 years in Georgia before moving was fond of observing in sermons that broken people are drawn to the church like moths to a flame. This is as true today as it was in antiquity. And so, to come back to our story, it turns out that the new convert is a member of a profession universally recognized as sinful. He is, brace yourselves, this is scandalous, an actor. In the Roman world, acting was considered to be just a step above prostitution, and barely. It was also connected with pagan worship, which added an extra level of sin for this profession in the eyes of Christians. Tough luck. But the problem is, a man must make a living somehow. Okay, over time, convicted of the sinful nature of his work, incompatible with his new life in Christ, the man resigns his job. Unable to find another occupation, he begins instead to teach private lessons to members of his congregation. Well, this may sound innocent enough, except he's teaching the very skills on which his old profession was based, acting. In other words, it seems like he's corrupting others in the church. Finally, at the end of his rope, scandalized and confused, the pastor of this church writes to another pastor to ask for advice and help. We learn about this story in one of the letters of Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage in the mid-3rd century AD. Cyprian was the wise friend to whom this other pastor wrote. And while we don't have the initial letter, we have Cyprian's response. In that response, Cyprian kindly sympathized with the difficult position of the other pastor. Yes, this is a bit of a headache, he affirmed. But how might we best care for this new convert, body and soul, he gently asks. Might he be engaging in scandalous behavior because he has no other means of supporting himself? Cyprian ends with offering his own funds to support the convert in question while he retrains for another job. That is, if his home church is unable to help. I find stories like this one fascinating. We get here a glimpse of the regular people in the early churches, one of the nameless multitudes, if you will. More than that, we learn the story of the convert that shows that people from all kinds of backgrounds were coming into the church in the mid-3rd century, even as the first ever empire-wide persecution had probably just concluded and a vicious pandemic was raging. If you thought 2020 was bad, I assure you, 251 AD was much, much worse. In fact, if you ever time travel back to the Roman Empire, do not go back to the 250s AD. Skip the 3rd century entirely. Highly recommend. Okay, so the regular Christians, both the new convert and those around him, don't look perfect in this story. But it gets more complicated. At the same time as we hear stories like this one, we also hear about the role that the love and service-minded heart of early Christians played in bringing others to the faith. Sociologist Rodney Stark spent much of his career writing about the transformational role of this care in bringing about conversions. A fraction of 1% of the Roman Empire was Christian around AD 200. By 300 AD, nearly 10% of the empire was. How did this happen? Stark says, because the Christians loved. And yet, to come back to our story about the actor, we see here a pastor who is rather exasperated with the problematic convert in his church. And he needs another pastor to serve as this practical voice of wisdom in resolving the situation compassionately. So let's put this all together now. All of these things, a heart for martyrdom and for serving others and bringing them into the church, but also a profound selfishness and an easy frustration with people who can't just get their act together and stop embarrassing us already. All of these things can be true all at once for people in the early church. Just like the same things can be true all at once for many or all of us. And so, reading the stories of many of the early Christians like this one, I find that they were surprisingly like us, influenced by the surrounding culture and sometimes really easily frustrated with other people. More than anything, it is convicting how many of them, like our actor friend whose story we just learned, went to church on Sunday but spent the rest of the week perhaps compartmentalizing their faith, just like so many Christians do today, perhaps inadvertently, without meaning to. And it is convicting, furthermore, to see that sometimes sin, like for this actor, cultural sin does not flow necessarily from a rebellious heart, but sometimes simply from a lack of better options. How well do we today support those in our own churches who seem deeply sinful, but perhaps are more similar to this actor, this new convert, than to someone rebelliously fighting against God? Ancient historians generally fall into two categories. Those who emphasize how different people in antiquity were from us today, and those who emphasize just how similar the human experience has been. As you may have gathered by now, I largely lean on the latter approach. We think of the ancient world as this foreign place, inhabited by people who were very different from us. In many ways, that is true. But I also want us to notice the ways in which the lives and everyday struggles of people in the ancient world, including in the early church, were more similar and relatable to ours than we might have imagined. Surprisingly often, their stories are our stories too. Now, one question that comes from studying all these sinners has to do with escaping it all. I mean, there's a certain logic here. If people are sinful and difficult and distract us from God, wouldn't the logical solution just be to escape it all, quit church, quit human society, and live on our own? A holy life enclosed in your own tiny apartment, subsisting on Uber Eats. You never have to leave your home ever again, and you can just become this saint on your own, right? It's a nice theory. I mean, it makes certain sense. We have stories from antiquity to see how it might go. Because that is the solution that the desert fathers and desert mothers tried out. Who were they? There were people who quit church and quit society altogether to move into the desert in late antiquity and pursue a life of holiness alone. They were saints, there's no question about it. But I think they also remind us, ironically, that the desert should never be our destination. Let us consider why not. In the late 3rd century AD, a Christian ascetic who had spent his life up to that point quietly organizing monastic communities in Egypt decided that the company of other people was just distracting him excessively from his spiritual priorities. And so, this ascetic, Antony, quit church and quit human society. He resolved to live out the rest of his life away from all people, seeking God relentlessly through prayer and extreme asceticism. It's actually kind of fascinating reading these lives of the desert fathers and mothers. It's like the stories, they're almost competing with each other, like who can subsist on fewer figs per week. Anyway, Antony moved into this abandoned old fort by the Nile, locking the gates from inside for good, or so he thought. It is ironically appropriate that Antony chose an abandoned fort as his place of refuge, but not for the reasons he thought. Various pilgrims and tourists who were fascinated with the idea of running away from society and moving into the desert slowly began trickling into the vicinity of his fort, effectively surrounding the shut-away saint. Not all of them were equally spiritual, but they were all seeking entertainment, this curiosity component. And so, in his fort, Antony was living increasingly under siege from like-minded quitters. Perhaps he put an extra bar on the gate. The siren call of the desert, as Antony's besieged existence reminds us, was strong for many Christians in late antiquity. As Athanasius, who published a best-selling Life of Antony, noted, the desert became a city. It appears that he was not exaggerating. A travelogue, Inquiry about the Monks of Egypt, is a narrative first-hand account of a trip that 7 monks from a Jerusalem monastery took around Egypt in 394-395 AD. The narrator, who chose to remain anonymous, describes the Egyptian desert in the late 4th century as a land taken over by ascetics, living in all kinds of caves, abandoned buildings, and even in one case, taking completely over a previously normal pagan city, Oxyrhynchus. You can't throw a stone around there without hitting a saint, they report. Some days, the desert's siren call sounds remarkably attractive to me across the centuries. I am an introvert who loves ideas. I'm also a homeschooling mom of talkative and very loud image bearers. So I can kind of see the appeal of the desert for Antony and those like him. The notion of silence, utter glorious silence, in which I could be alone with my thoughts and ideas. If I'm being honest, it's an idol. My husband knows that the best gift he can give me is quiet time alone. True, I can imagine God speaking to me in that silence in a way that I don't think I could ever hear his voice over the louder voices of the really beautiful, lovely people in my life. Indeed, I'm reminded of one desert father, John the Dwarf, who told a visitor who came to see him to stop talking and leave so he could hear God's voice again. And yet, I must admit that my desire for the desert and its idyllic peace does not stem primarily from spiritual thirst, but from selfishness. People are difficult, even lovely people, and loud. They're really loud. And abandoning doing life with people is a really easy way out. But this gets us to 2 really important and related questions. What or who is the desert anyway? And second, does moving into the desert ever solve anything for anyone who is not the Son of God? And this is where Antony's story has useful warnings for us still. The mental image of the abandoned fort where Antony took his refuge is powerful. It represents the fragility of institutions of conquest and these civilized buildings in the face of a relentless and ever-growing desert. To forcibly civilize a desert is always temporary. Ultimately, the wilderness will always win. But the image of the fort also reminds us of the power of walls, even walls that are crumbling, to hide and protect those within. Still, words are more powerful than walls. Stories about Antony circulated by word of mouth throughout Egypt and beyond after his disappearance inside the fort, only growing more elaborate over 20 years. And finally, one day, 20 years later, taking matters into their own hands, the curious crowd that had been increasingly besieging his fort broke in. This image of Christian ascetics and pilgrims breaking down the doors of a fort to see a saint seems incongruous. This was not war, but pilgrimage. But the walls for these pilgrims were the enemy. They were barring them from a miracle they were determined to see with their own eyes. What they found inside did not disappoint. They found Antony looking exactly as he did the way he walked inside that fort 20 years earlier, youthful and beautiful, unaffected by 2 decades of wrestling with demons. Extreme abuse of his body through starvation, very little sleep, and again, those daily battles with demons who, as it turns out, could not be locked out of the fort quite so easily as people. Continued battles with demons, representing various personal sins, are a regular feature of the biographies of the desert saints. Even as some of them retreated further and further away from people and into the desert, into the utter solitude of caves or fortification walls, their own demons went with them undeterred. And so, Antony and other desert fathers found that the desert was not a place of solitude and spiritual comfort. Instead, the desert was a place to be face to face with one's own sins and demons, but without any of the support structures that the church and community can offer in the fray. And this warning applies to us as well. It can be tempting to try and live a holy life of solitude without others. For the sensory overwhelmed in particular, the silence of the desert can seem a gift. But without the community of others, a community spiritual, scholarly, neighborly, familial, we are the desert. This is not a good thing. Ultimately, yes, we live in the world, but we should strive to be not of it. And so, in considering cultural Christians, ancient and modern, the biggest takeaway that I have to offer you is this: may we grow in love for the people around us. May we not give up on the relationships that need our support and that in turn nourish our own ever-thirsty souls. And may we serve others around us. That is what countercultural Christianity is. Thank you.
Well, everyone, we're going to enter into a time of Q&A, and so we'd love to hear questions from you, and Dr. Williams is going to take some. If you could, as able, we have some runners back here. They'll hand you a mic. If you could stand to ask your question just so she can see you, that'd be great. We'll get started.
Hello. First of all, I'd just like to thank you for coming out to talk to us. So you mentioned how in the Roman Empire, because of their culture, certain sins that might be shocking to us, like prostitution, would have actually been quite palatable to them. What do you think are some examples of sins that are fashionable specifically to our day and age?
That's a good question. And I guess one really common one that the church really struggles with is cohabiting before marriage. It's kind of funny because in the Roman Empire, on the one hand, you have prostitution that is accepted. Today, we have this other thing that is accepted. And either one, again, you see the cultural baggage, what people do all around. It's like, well, everybody's doing it. So it seems like a respectable sin. But
you said in your talk, human nature and or sin.
Oh.
So is all of human nature sin in your eyes, or is there a difference between some of human nature being okay and some of it being sin?
Well, there's definitely a difference. I mean, the imago Dei, we are all made in God's image. So there are certain aspects of us that are just really beautiful, that reflect this nature as created by God. But there's certainly a lot of sin also, and sometimes we are really uncomfortable talking about it. It was actually kind of funny because when I was first pitching this book to publishers, one editor who I talked to was a little bit concerned. It was like, do we need a book about sin? I was like, well, I think we do. But anyway. But yeah, that's a good distinction. Obviously, not all of human nature is this terrible thing, but yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming. I want to think about the phrase cultural Christian a bit. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think when we use that phrase, we're worried about what happens when Christianity becomes culturally acceptable, mm-hmm. and the effect, maybe a negative effect that could have upon how people live out their cultural Christian faith. So what should be the relationship of what Christians are trying to do to culture while recognizing the influence that culture then has upon Christians? So maybe it's the Constantine problem or solution, depending on what you want to say about it.
I actually don't think it's a Constantine problem. I think it goes to the earliest point. Stephen Presley recently wrote a book on cultural sanctification, and I've thought of it kind of like the two of us were working on our respective books at the same time, so I didn't see his until it came out. But it was fascinating because he looked at that other side, that, like, on the one hand, yes, we have cultural Christians and cultural sin. On the other hand, we also have Christians from the earliest days who were trying to sanctify the culture around them simply by living out their faith. And both of these things can be true at the same time. It's just that we can't, what I argue is culture makes sure that we can't be perfect in how we live out our faith. At least not on this side of heaven.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight, Dr. Williams. So I was wondering, you said the best way to be counterculture Christians is to love those around us. How do you as a Christian love the people around you if they're like living in some active areas of sin and still standing your ground on like what you believe to be true, but how do you still love them, if that makes sense as a question?
Yeah, and that's where it gets really tricky because we are grounded in the real world. And especially for you guys, college students on a secular campus, you probably have friends who are not, or acquaintances at least, who are not Christians. And then the question of like, how do you love them and serve them? And that's something that the early Christians were dealing with. And what's so striking, like what Rodney Stark's research is, Christians served everybody around them, regardless of whether they were believers or not. And I think that's powerful, that testimony of serving others. And perhaps you don't have as many opportunities for that as a college student, but certainly as you get older, as you are plugged in your local church, and you have the opportunity to participate in all kinds of activities through that, you can reach out. I mean, they're even just like the most obvious things that we don't think about because it's the 21st century, so everybody just goes home, drives into their garage, and don't talk to anybody. Well, we're the weird people who talk to our neighbors, and so on. Like, that's, make these friendships, make these connections, pay attention to other people. You never know. I mean, every person you interact with is an image bearer, and you don't know what they're going through or suffering, and it's just, yeah, it's something that is really uncomfortable and countercultural to our own day.
So obviously there's some relevancy in history of the aspect of, on one side, looking up towards people as Augustine, Anselm, Chrysostom, and the like. On the other side, there's this aspect where we're realizing that in historically we do see cultural Christianity. I think, and you may have touched on this as well, in this aspect of sanctification, but isn't there an aspect where one is guiding their life towards Christ, and that being the example, rather than putting their eyes on the cultural Christianities and look at them, or idolization of historic Christians, if that makes any sense?
we are certainly thinking about Christ, and that's something that very much comes through in how the early, the bishops, the leaders in early churches were thinking, and just the reminders that they had for members of their congregations, like Cyprian, who talked about how we know how the story ends, and Augustine in City of God, the whole point of like, we know how the story ends, and that gives us courage to pursue Christ in the presence and live a different life than the people around. So that's where, the responsibility of pastors, both in antiquity and today, so much of the work of pastors is reminding people every day, every week, that we are pursuing Christ. That is our goal.
What is some secondhand smoke that you have experienced culturally, and how did you uncover that?
That's a good question. I came to Christ at age 30, so I feel like I lived in secondhand smoke for 30 years before. But a lot of it was something that perhaps you guys, as university students at a prestigious university, are familiar with, which is the idol of academic success. I mean, it's not a bad thing, and yet that was perhaps the secondhand smoke that I lived in, because that was the message that I grew up with, that if you do well in school, all will go well with you in life. It was like this gospel of academic success, and it took me 3 decades to get to a year when everything fell apart in my life, and I realized that's a lie. But it's a difficult one. And it's a reminder also that there are so many good things that we can twist into sins or secondhand smoke. It's not a bad thing for you to want to do well in school, but when it becomes an ultimate thing, that's a problem.
So you mentioned that that early church had, an actor, and that people saw being an actor in ancient Rome as being sinful. Do you, in your understanding of what actors did in ancient Rome, do you think that was an inherently sinful profession with what they were expected to do, or do you think that was a bit of an oversimplification or a misconception?
Well, so there was quite a number of professions in antiquity that were considered kind of disreputable. And this was one. But I think what's more relevant for us is not necessarily that that's how people perceived him, but rather the fact that somebody like that came into the church. So I think what the pastor of the church where it happened and Cyprian were trying to process was, how do you treat someone who doesn't look like a Christian? How do you welcome them into the church? And that's where the question is really timeless for us as well. Because people convert, and sometimes really unusual people convert, and praise be to God that they do. But then the question is, how do we treat them? How do you welcome someone who doesn't look like they belong? That's hard.
Hi. I'm curious, when you brought up the, narrator saying you can go into the desert and throw a stone and find a saint, how were these desert fathers and mothers thought of by the overall Christian culture at the time, putting up their personal pursuit of holiness and their relationship with God versus the command to, go out and make disciples and live in community? Were they thought of as they are often thought of in a positive light for that pursuit, or I'm just curious?
Yeah, well, it was kind of complicated. By the way, that's the cheat answer historians will give you for everything. The answer is always it's complicated. That's why nobody likes us at dinner parties. Anyway, but to answer your question, I will answer your question. It's actually really fascinating because a whole tourism culture emerged around visiting these desert saints. You could basically go on tour around Egypt and visit all these weird people who lived on whatever wild vegetables or just occasionally popped up to bless the crowd out of a tower or something like that. So it became this, because there was a pagan version of the Grand Tour. You know, you go see Delphi and all the holy sites of the ancient Mediterranean. Well, and we see in late antiquity a Christian version of this Grand Tour emerge, that you could go visit a bunch of these holy ascetics, and they become these weird spectacles, and you kind of wonder, like, why do people do this? But then I would say that we see the same thing already in the Gospels with John the Baptist. Like, when Jesus asked, why did you go see this guy in the desert? And I think for some people it was just kind of fascinating. Like, there's a guy in the desert eating like locusts and wild honey. It's like, that's kind of interesting. If you have a free day, like, go see him. That's that spirit. I mean, some of the people who went to do this, of course, were believers. But then there were other people where it's like just, an interesting thing to see. And so the same thing with those ascetics and saints. So there was kind of a mix of like, this is attractive, fascinating, I want to see this. Like, motivations varied.
We may look about going back to the desert culture or whatever, but a lot of young people in this room maybe have heard some of the ancient stories about that, their grandparents talking about that they had their Sunday clothes, and on Sunday they went to Sunday, and there was Wednesday night, there were no ball games on Wednesday night, there was no soccer things or whatever, there were blue laws, there were things that you couldn't and do whatever. And so sometimes we look at that, well, the ancient culture of whatever and the impact of cultural Christianity, and how much facade as opposed to some of that in the life in the world, and then the new struggles of today's young person in expressing and their culture in today's university setting and in the world in which they are around.
Well, I appreciate that. Like, the culture can change, but we keep wrestling with it. It might seem, and it's easy to idealize things sometimes, like the days when Wednesday nights were sacred. But yeah. And there were probably still plenty of cultural Christians around.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, how do we confront sin in a cultural Christian's life, right? Do we take that Matthew 18 approach of bringing it up, or a fear of mine is to friends that are culturally Christian in my life, I have a fear of bringing that up because I'm not sure how they would respond. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, start with yourself rather than with others, which is so much harder, by the way. It's a lot easier, for everybody, and that's the whole point with going into the desert. It's a lot easier to say other people are the problem. If you just remove other sinners from my life, I'm going to be great. But that's not true. And so I would say start with self-examination, which is just so hard. And so much of it does take place in community, thoughtful, prayerful, trusting, faithful community. We must, I keep saying this over and over, but we must all become better theologians. And a lot of it has to do with applying all of this to ourselves, to our own lives. I feel like I started getting a little better at this when I turned 40, so you may have a few years to go. I don't know, maybe parenting has something to do with it. Marriage is very sanctifying too, but it's all these, but it happens in community. But then I look at older people at my church and I think, they're amazing. I hope I'm like you when I'm 70. So something happens, sanctification, this lifelong process. People who have walked with Jesus for decades, it really shows. But yeah, it starts with this self-examination.
Hello, Dr. Williams. Thank you again for the lecture tonight. So my question is, you mentioned communal sins. You may not have used that word, but like prostitution, where historically they've been viewed as maybe not have been viewed as very stingy or what have you. But now, clearly, I would say we would all agree as a culture, we view that specific sin as, it's a little icky, right? So my question is
more than a little icky.
Sure.
Okay.
Pardon me. Guys, promise I'm not, into that sort of thing. Anyways, sorry, Dr. Williams. So, but my question would be, historically, is there any patterns that you see as cultures sort of move out of that frame of mind? And specifically, if you could give us any encouragement of how do we sort of be that cultural change today? And maybe you answered a bit of that with Cameron's question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it really seems like every period, every time period, every culture, and even a region, has its own flavor. So really the best I can tell you is be in thoughtful Christian community. That's where the local church is so wonderful, but also just other supporting structures. And it seems like for the Lewis House, like you have this opportunity for theological education as part of your college experience. Like that's valuable.
Hi, Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I had a question in regards to cultural Christianity and how you experience that as a mother, because I recognize, especially coming from your deep involvement in academia and then jumping into totally homeschooling your kids, I'm curious how you navigate some of their questions that I'm sure they have about, oh, I heard this from somebody. I'm not sure what kinds of secular involvement your children are in or even how old they are, but I'm curious about how you plan to or have already navigated cultural Christianity while trying to raise children and make them the best followers of Christ that they could be.
Yeah, that's a good question. On the one hand, we try to kind of keep them under a rock when it comes to like a lot of culture. So like they don't really get, we don't have a television in the home. So like we hardly ever watch anything. Occasionally there's been like, I feel like Ratatouille is safe. Although I can't watch it. The idea of a rat cooking, it's like, anyway, it gives me anxiety. But I feel like otherwise it's safe. As far as cultural things. But on the other hand, so there have been books that my children have liked where something occasionally comes up where we have to have a difficult conversation. So there was a particular series of books where the first several books were totally fine, and then we got like the next new one in the series, and there was a gay character where it was sort of like, okay, I wasn't expecting to field these questions today with my 8-year-old, but I guess we're gonna have to go there and have this conversation. Like, how do you love people while also recognizing like this is a sin, this is a problem? And how do you explain like all of that rich theology of our bodies and who we are in God in the 21st century, where apparently it's totally normal in a book for 8-year-olds to have something like this, where it's like, I was not expecting this. I thought I had a few more years. So there are those situations where it happens, and ultimately what it involves is having these conversations with kids and just kind of reminding them that it's not about shutting off other people, but it is about knowing who they are in Christ.
Got a couple final questions, one over here and one over here.
Hello, Dr. Williams. I enjoyed listening to you. I'm a fellow homeschooling mom, and I very much relate with a lot of what you said, to include idolizing silence sometimes. Mom of 7, and 2 are grown and out of the house, so I still have 5 at home that I am currently homeschooling. But I think you answered mostly my question, but basically filtering the secondhand smoke, as you would so aptly put it, filtering the secondhand smoke while not completely sheltering them and making them kind of unable or ill-equipped to serve unbelievers. And I don't know the age of your children, but mine still at home are age 4 to 16. And so helping them, and I think you started to answer it, to see how we are all made in the image of God and how sin has corrupted that. But then how do you best filter out without maybe another application besides just not having the television, maybe some other practical tips? I'm always learning.
Yeah.
So.
Well, a lot of it has to do, like, what are we consuming? Because at any given point, we are consuming something. Like, when it comes to reading, listening, just studying, we are filling our minds with things. And so the question is, are we filling our minds with things that are beautiful, that are good, that are true? And that's kind of been our focus, is just, we read a lot of books. And it seems like we read a lot of older books. And by older, I don't necessarily mean just Greek and Roman, because, by the way, Greek and Roman literature has plenty of issues as well. That's, like, there's so much, yeah. Those of you who have read, say, like, Greek comedy, I remember one of the times that I was teaching Greek comedy to, as part of a class on the Athenian democracy, and it was actually graduate students, and one of them came up to me later and said, I thought Greeks were respectable people, and I've never read so many fart jokes. And that's like, okay, yeah, so maybe, like, not all of this is appropriate for younger ages necessarily, but it does add up to the question of being more deliberate for all of us, really, not just for kids, but a lot of these issues. I mean, we think about it protecting our children, but really it's about all of us, like protecting our minds. What are we thinking about? What are we filling our minds with? And I really want to cultivate that beauty, that wonder, yeah. And occasional ratatouille, I guess, is okay. That's, so.
Dr. Williams, thank you so much for being here tonight. Later, I'd love to know whether you are an after a while crocodile or a see you later alligator type of girl, but great joke. Final question for you. So 2 things have come up tonight that stood out. One was you mentioned St. Anthony, who's typically pretty lionized and considered a hero in the church, and yet you seem to have some differing opinions. And then we talked about prostitutes and actors and artists who are the very people that Jesus sought out. And so I would just wonder whether your position on St. Anthony and those like him amounts to a criticism of what we tended to lionize in the church, and how that interacts with the fact that Jesus sought out the very disreputable people that we seem hesitant to engage with.
Well, I think that's a fantastic question. And what I want to say is, I'm not saying that Antony was a problem. What I'm saying is we should not all feel like this is the solution for us. And even Antony's own solution, I think 20 years later, after 20 years, perhaps he would have realized that it didn't work the way he expected it to. And we have that same story from so many other desert saints who are reported to have said things like, I've spent 30 years alone and I still struggle with anger. It's like, really? And those moments of realization that we take our sins everywhere we go, even Saint Anthony. But at the same time, I think absolutely Jesus' example reminds us that people are not what we see on the surface, but God sees who they really are. And that's a warning for us in church, in trying to minister, especially to, like, really unusual, uncomfortable converts. But in a way, it's also the story of parenting. Anybody who has parented, like, can tell you, it's like, wow, you see a lot of sin every day. A lot of it from you, but also, like, in your children. And I feel like it's taught me more about patience and being more welcoming to people who are really, like, sometimes not behaving the way I would have expected.
Actually, I lied. I'm going to ask one final question. It's going to be from me. So I normally don't ask questions, but we'll use it as a segue question to our next lecture. So you often get people who accuse, be it from the right and the left, politically in our culture, they accuse the other side of being, culturally influenced. So you have maybe people on the political left might accuse the right of just being, culturally influenced by capitalism, and that's all they care about is corporate greed or these sorts of things. And then vice versa, you have people who accuse maybe someone on the right accuse the left of being shaped by identity politics or some sort of radical individualism or some such thing as this that secular culture has produced. So when you see people accusing other people, be it political or other ways of accusing people of being influenced by culture, how would you advise us to adjudicate those things, both as we want to accuse others or we look at ourselves? I know you talked about self-examination and the like, but are there some markers that you would just just once again highlight, and I think you've hit on some of this and some other points, but what would you advise us of how to see in ourselves those markers, or see in others as we need to, though probably best to start with ourselves. What are some of the markers you look for to say, I think you're being influenced, I think I can smell the smoke in your clothes, as it were?
Yeah, that's such a difficult question. And I would say that's where being biblically grounded is so important. Like, go back to the Bible. Because a lot of people who claim to accuse others of not being good Christians, whether on the left or the right, are actually making very, theologically incompetent arguments. And that exists on both sides. So again, that reminder that we all must become better theologians, and especially be much more biblically grounded than perhaps we'd like to think. There's a lot of lazy rhetoric on both sides, I find. The scandal of the evangelical mind is still alive and well, and that's where better, thoughtful Christianity is what we really need.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the tip that they say to spot counterfeit bills, you should study the authentic ones, and then you can spot the counterfeits easier. So in this case, you're saying, go back to Scripture, study the life of Jesus, study what he's about, study the lives of the saints there, what he's called us to, and then you can spot the countercultural, or the cultural Christians. Yeah, well, great.
Absolutely.
Well, would you all please put your hands together and thank Dr. Williams for her time tonight? So, good. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, she is free from young children and bedtime routines, so she doesn't have to sprint out of here. So if you do want to catch her and ask maybe a question you didn't get a chance to, Dr. Williams will be hanging out here for a few minutes. We do have a few of her books over here. If you'd like to grab one of those, I'm sure she'd be glad to sign a copy. And we have some other books as well. We do, again, as a reminder, have our next lecture here Tuesday, October the 15th at 7 p.m., where we talk about the roundtable discussion on politics. Again, if you want to follow us on social media at Lewis House Lex, and we are so honored to have you here. I'm so thankful. If you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to grab me, any of our other staff. We're thankful you're here and hope to see you again. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.